Story name: The Hymn of Hollow Saints. That night, the bells tolled in Hollow Hills, though no one had lived in the old town for 50 years. Thomas Harlow first heard them while driving down Route 19, his truck's tires humming on the cracked asphalt. It was a cold October night, the kind that put frost on your breath and ghosts in your head. He was alone, or so he thought, until the bells rang through the trees like distant voices whispering his name. He checked the clock on the dashboard. 2:37 a.m. A bad hour. An hour when most accidents happened, when the world felt thinner, stretched too tight. He was just passing the Hollow Hills exit when something moved on the side of the road. A shape, tall and thin, standing just at the edge of the trees. His foot eased off the gas. His gut told him to keep driving, to let the night swallow whatever he saw, but his hands had other ideas. Before he knew it, he was pulling onto the old dirt road that led into Hollow Hills. The town had been abandoned for decades. Fires, disappearances, rumors of something that lived beneath the church. None of it was good. But the bells were calling, and Thomas had never been the kind of man to ignore a call. As his truck rolled into town, the fog thickened, curling around buildings like fingers dragging through the dirt. The main street was still standing, though the buildings sagged, their wooden bones broken by time. The church at the end of the road was the only thing untouched. Its steeple rose high, the cross at its peak glinting under the moonlight. And the bells, they were still ringing. Thomas killed the engine and stepped out, breath misting in the cold air. He had no reason to be here. No real reason. But something tugged at him, deep in his chest, like a rope wrapped around his ribs. He walked forward, boots crunching against the gravel. The church doors stood open, yawning like the mouth of something long dead. Inside, candles burned, lining the pews in neat rows, their flames flickering as if someone had just walked by. The air smelled of wax, dust, and something else, something rotten. And then he saw them. The saints. At first, he thought they were statues. Figures in robes, heads bowed, hands clasped in prayer. But as he stepped closer, he saw their faces. Not stone. Not wood. Flesh. Their skin was stretched too tight, lips stitched shut with black thread. Their eyes were open, but there was nothing behind them, only blackness, deep and endless. The hymn began, not with voices, but with a low hum, rising from the walls, from the floor beneath him. The saints began to move, their hands lifting, fingers twitching like marionettes on unseen strings. Thomas backed away. He wanted to run, to get in his truck and never look back. But the doors slammed shut, and the bells grew louder. A figure stepped from the shadows, taller than the saints, its face hidden beneath a hood. You heard the call. It said, voice low and wet, like something speaking from underwater. Thomas couldn't answer. His throat had closed, breath locked behind his ribs. The figure took another step closer. You will sing. The saints turned to him in unison. Their lips curled despite the stitches. And they smiled. Thomas stumbled back, heart hammering. The saints moved in eerie unison, their stitched lips curling in grotesque smiles. The hooded figure raised a hand, and the hymn shifted. The humming became a vibration in the air, pressing against his skull. He clenched his teeth. I don't belong here. His voice cracked. The figure tilted its head. You were chosen. The candles flickered. Shadows stretched across the walls, bending unnaturally. The saints took slow, deliberate steps forward, their bare feet silent on the stone floor. Thomas lunged for the door, but his legs locked. He wasn't paralyzed. No, something held him in place. His limbs were his own, but they wouldn't obey. A force, unseen and ancient, had claimed him. "You will sing," the figure repeated. "You will join the hymn." Thomas fought against the invisible grip, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The saints raised their hands. A thick, wet sound filled the air. Stitching unraveling. Black threads slipped from their lips, dropping to the floor like dead insects. Their mouths gaped open, but no tongues remained, just raw, hollow spaces. A whisper slithered through the church. Not voices, memories. They poured into his mind, flashes of fire, screams swallowed by the bells, a town erased. Hollow Hills hadn't been abandoned. It had been devoured. The figure reached for him. A hand like carved bone brushed his forehead. Cold seeped into his skull, deeper than thought, deeper than fear. The hymn crawled inside him. It wasn't sound. It was hunger. Thomas felt his own lips moving. His jaw unhinged, his throat vibrating. The song wasn't sung. It was pulled from the soul, stripped away like flesh from bone. His knees buckled. A single, twisted note left his mouth. The saints shuddered. The air thickened, pressing against his ribs. But something in him rebelled. He wasn't ready to be hollow. Summoning every ounce of will, he forced his body to move. His fingers dug into his own arm, nails breaking skin. The sharp pain grounded him. His foot slid backward. The figure hesitated. The saints faltered. A crack splintered through the silence. The front door, locked just moments ago, swung open with a gust of freezing wind. Thomas didn't question it. He ran. The hymn screamed behind him, a wail of something ancient and enraged. Hands clawed for him, grasping air. Shadows lunged. He dove through the doorway, hitting the cold earth. Silence. The bells had stopped. Thomas scrambled to his feet, chest heaving. The church loomed in the darkness, its doors shut tight. No candles. No figures. No saints. Just a crumbling ruin, lifeless and empty. Had it been real? His truck sat where he left it, engine still warm. He yanked the door open, hands trembling. As he slid behind the wheel, he caught his reflection in the rearview mirror. A black thread hung from his lips. And deep in his throat, something hummed. The hymn was not finished. Thomas stared at the black thread hanging from his lips, pulse pounding in his ears. His hands trembled as he reached up, fingers hesitant, afraid to touch it. It felt wrong, like something left inside him, something that didn't belong. He pulled. A sharp pain lanced through his jaw, deep into his throat, as if the thread had hooked onto something beneath his skin. His vision blurred. The hum grew louder. His fingers slipped, and the thread recoiled, vanishing back into his mouth. His breath came fast, ragged. The truck's cabin felt smaller, air thick as if he were still inside that damned church. He had to get out of here. The engine roared to life, and he slammed his foot on the gas. Gravel kicked up behind him as he tore down the road, hollow hills shrinking in the rearview mirror. But the bells, faint, distant, still ringing. His knuckles whitened around the wheel. He cranked up the radio, but the speakers only hissed, filling the truck with a hollow, rasping static. Then, beneath the static, a voice. "You will sing." His breath hitched. The truck swerved. He yanked the wheel, barely missing the guardrail. His heartbeat thundered in his chest. No, this wasn't real. He drove for miles, pushing the truck to its limits, until the road stretched into familiar territory. Streetlights, gas stations, civilization. The hum faded. By the time he reached his apartment, the sky had begun to lighten with the early morning glow. Thomas staggered inside, locking the door behind him. But the silence felt wrong. His reflection in the hallway mirror caught his eye. He looked normal. Tired, but normal. He exhaled, steadying himself. Maybe it had been a hallucination. Exhaustion messing with his head. He turned away from the mirror, and his reflection did not move. Cold terror shot through him. His body locked in place, heart slamming against his ribs. His reflection stood frozen, staring at him with wide, unblinking eyes. Then slowly it smiled. His lips, his other lips, began to move. Not in words, in a hum. A melody he knew but had never learned. The hymn. Thomas stumbled backward. His own breath echoed in his ears, ragged and uneven. His reflection stepped forward, pressing a hand against the glass. The surface rippled, like water disturbed by a stone. His reflection's mouth opened, and from it, the black thread slithered out. It coiled, twisting like a living thing, reaching toward the real Thomas. He turned, running for the bedroom, slamming the door shut behind him. His heart pounded as he grabbed his phone, hands shaking. He needed help. Someone. Anyone. His fingers hovered over his contacts. Who would believe this? The humming grew louder. A whisper seeped through the walls. You will sing. His vision swam. The walls shifted. They weren't walls anymore. They were pews. Candles flickered around him. The smell of wax and rot filled his lungs. No, this wasn't possible. He turned toward the door, but there was no door. Only the entrance to the church. He was back in Hollow Hills. The saints stood in their rows, waiting. The hooded figure stepped forward, tilting its head. You cannot run from a hymn once it has begun. Thomas tried to move, but his body betrayed him. The black thread curled from his lips, longer this time, stretching toward the saints. And then he understood. They hadn't been forced to sing. They had become part of it. And now, so would he. The thread snapped taut. His mouth opened wide. And the hymn finally took him. Thomas's jaw stretched unnaturally wide as the black thread coiled from his mouth, winding like a living thing, its end disappearing into the waiting hands of the saints. His body convulsed. His vision blurred, flickering between the candlelit church and his dimly lit bedroom. His reflection still stood in the mirror, watching. Smiling. The thread pulled tighter. Pain shot through his skull, spreading like cracks in shattered glass. Memories that weren't his flooded in, faces of those who had come before him, lost souls who had answered the bells and never returned. They had all sung. They had all become hollow. Not him. Thomas clenched his fists, fighting against the pull. His body wanted to submit, but his mind screamed for survival. Resist. His hands found the thread at his lips, trembling fingers gripping the dark, sinewy cord. It burned against his skin, but he pulled. The moment he did, the saints shrieked. The candle flames surged higher, casting monstrous shadows that twisted along the church walls. The hooded figure staggered, its faceless cowl snapping toward him as if surprised. The thread writhed violently, lashing against his face, trying to root itself deeper. Thomas yanked harder. His throat felt like it was being ripped apart from the inside. He screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the overwhelming hum of the hymn. The saints moved in unison, arms outstretched, mouths gaping in soundless horror. The hooded figure raised a skeletal hand. "You do not break the hymn," it hissed. "You become it." The walls of the church trembled. The air thickened, pressing against his skin, wrapping around him like unseen hands. The black thread snapped. A sound like splitting bone echoed through the church. The saints shrieked louder, their stitched mouths sealing shut in an instant. The candles blew out, plunging the space into absolute darkness. Silence. For the first time since he had stepped into Hollow Hills, the bells were gone. Thomas collapsed to the cold ground, gasping for air. His throat burned, raw from whatever had tried to claim him. His hands trembled, the broken threads still curled around his fingers like dead vines. The hooded figure remained still, watching him. Then, ever so slowly, it began to melt. The fabric of its robe disintegrated, revealing nothing but shadow. The saints cracked apart like dried clay, their hollow forms collapsing into dust. The walls of the church groaned, shifting, breaking. And then, the church was gone. Thomas found himself on the floor of his bedroom, bathed in cold sweat. His body ached, his hands still curled as if gripping something that no longer existed. The mirror stood across from him. His reflection was back to normal. No smile, no humming, just him. He staggered to his feet, staring at his own exhausted face. His lip was bleeding, where the thread had once been. He touched it, half expecting to feel the black cord still there. Nothing. It was over. The bells of Hollow Hills had fallen silent. For now. As he turned away, exhausted beyond belief, he didn't notice the small, black thread curled at the base of the mirror. It twitched. And deep within the glass, a figure watched, waiting. If you've enjoyed this journey into the unknown, don't forget to like the video and share your thoughts in the comments below. Have a tale of your own or a legend you'd like us to explore? Let us know. You might just hear it next. Be sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss a story. Because here the darkness is always waiting just for you.